Oxford University professor John Lennox was interviewed by Alex O'Connor on his channel Within Reason. They had a far-reaching discussion about science, reason, evidence, and faith that was really, really quite wonderful. At one point, they discussed the dangers of certainty and the need for what I would call the virtue of open-mindedness.
I'm always prepared to question what I believe.
In a previous video, I looked at Jordan Peterson's Jubilee appearance, where he sits down with 20 atheists. It was super chippy, super combative, aimed at gotcha moments, and just generally unproductive. That one's hard to get through, but I think this one with Alex O'Connor and John Lennox is the opposite. You have two very interesting and I think thoughtful people coming from very different perspectives. Right, John Lennox is a Christian, whereas Alex O'Connor is an atheist, or I think I've heard him more recently call himself an agnostic. But they treat each other with respect, right? Mutual respect. And while they have these disagreements, they're just not aimed at winning each little exchange. They're aimed at understanding what each other are saying, learning perhaps, and only then pushing back. It's actually a very productive conversation. Now, what made for the difference? I want to suggest it's an issue of intellectual virtue. I think intellectual virtue is on display here. At one point, they talk about the issue of certainty and how it can be a destructive force. Now, the lead in for this part of the discussion is when the late Christopher Hitchens comes up. Christopher Hitchens was a new atheist, and he often would complain against religion and Christianity because of the evils and the scandals done in the name of the church or done in the name of Christianity. What's interesting is that Alex himself addresses this complaint by making the point that whether the evils of the church is a problem for the truth of Christianity has all to do with Jesus and his moral behavior.
The important question is, like, with Christianity, Jesus. And for me, it's quite straightforward, as I feel like it might be for you too, in that if somebody says, well, what about this thing that these Christians did? If the question is whether Christianity is true, then the question is wholly, well, would Jesus have condoned or commanded such a thing? And if the answer is no, then it's not an objection at all.
Now, I find this super refreshing. I've always thought of this objection as something of a cheap shot against Christianity. Now, of course, the church has done evil. Christians have done evil things, continue to do evil things at times. And people have been hurt and people have been abused. And we want to be sensitive to that. And we need to address that and call that out. But as an objection to the truth of Christianity, the fact that some people in the name of Christianity have done evil things, it just doesn't speak to that. It becomes something of a fallacy of guilt by association. And so Alex doesn't see this as an objection to the truth of Christianity, but he sort of presses it to say, maybe there's something about Christianity and other religious traditions that can lead to these moral evils, and that would be the issue of religious certainty, where someone stops questioning their religious commitments.
But the fear that someone like Christopher Hitchens has is that the kind of certainty that comes along with that conviction, which, as you've just explained, like when somebody has a religious experience, that is what compels them. And it happens in a way that is indescribable and is immune to any kind of scientific or philosophical inquiry. But that certainty can then spill over into areas where it doesn't belong, such as certainty on doctrine, certainty on moral practices specific to our current time that weren't discussed by Jesus, for example. And I think that's the kind of fear that he had.
Now, I'm not even sure that religious experience should put our beliefs into a category where they're immune to scientific and philosophical inquiry, or at least inquiry in general, right? And this is because religious experience is often very thin. It's not clear always what we should believe in light of that experience. It has to be interpreted. Bill Maher was once asked whether he would believe if God audibly spoke to him. And his response was, if I thought God was speaking to me, I'd check myself into Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital And I think you should too. Now, should you check yourself into a psychiatric hospital given a religious experience? No, of course not. But it does highlight the point that there's very little that's not at least questionable, right? Hearing an audible voice, well, you're probably going to believe some things, right? But it's at least possible that something else is going on there. It's at least worth asking some questions. And again, that might all be 100% legit, and it might be 100% an experience of God, but we still have to interpret the experience. And here, our interpretation shouldn't be immune to being questioned. Perhaps that's what O'Connor means by doctrine, but that's a very fine line, and I think it's difficult to separate out. But his point is that people can become so committed to their religious commitments, and this, of course, doesn't always lead to evil, but it could.
And what would you say to quell his concerns that it is that religious impulse, that experience that somebody knows they have God on their side, that gives them the license to do all kinds of evil?
It's really a question of whether or not certainty is a good thing, especially when it can have this poisoning effect. The way that Hitchens would put is that religion poisons everything. So given the fact that it can have this poisoning effect and it can lead to evil, is certainty a good thing?
Answering your question is difficult because I sense its thrust and its power, actually, because it seems to me a very valid thing that certainty can become what I call fundamentalist certainty. And I think that's what you're referring to,
Hmm.
where people are so certain that their receptors are completely closed to anything else.
Right.
And that justifies almost any kind of behavior. And that's appalling. And I asked myself, what has saved me from that? I think what has helped me immensely in life is that I've been very privileged to, how shall I put it? I've been prepared for the last 70 years or more to be vulnerable. In other words, I'm always prepared to question what I believe.
The move from certainty to fundamentalist certainty, I think, is a great way to put it. You can be utterly convinced of something, right? You can have a kind of like psychological certainty, or we might call that a conviction, but that doesn't mean we should be fundamentalists. Now, fundamentalism is another one of these terms that's understood differently by different people. Historically, even it's been used to mean different things. Oftentimes today, it's used as kind of a slam or as a pejorative. I don't mean it as a slam. I'm not trying to put anybody down with this. I'm just trying to describe someone whose posture towards their beliefs is one in which no questions are allowed. They are what we might call completely closed-minded. This fundamentalism or closed-mindedness, I'd suggest, is an intellectual vice for the following reason. You might have a belief, and if you're closed-minded, you're not willing to question it. What if that belief is false? If you've not allowed for a belief to even be questioned, then, right, you'll not know whether or not the belief is true or false for that matter, right? You really don't have knowledge. And there are plenty of religious fundamentalists of this sort where their, religious commitments are not open to being questioned. And that, again, is something of a vice. But Lennox makes the point that there are plenty of non-religious folks who are equally fundamentalists.
I have seen in my life the sadness that comes about when people become fundamentalist in any direction. And I was very honored to be invited by the British Academy some years ago to give a lecture on, wait for it, scientific fundamentalism.
So by contrast, open-mindedness is an intellectual virtue. I think of open-mindedness is sort of best defined as the willingness to consider the possibility of the truth of a view, even if it strikes one as initially implausible. Many things can seem initially plausible that can turn out to be quite true, right? We've all probably been there at times. But like every virtue, we can take this to an extreme. Remember that, right? A virtue is always the middle way, right? Where there is a deficiency on one hand and then the extreme or the excess on the other. Going all the way back to Aristotle, right, where he sees a virtue as always something of a moderation, right? We won't sort of land on the virtue unless we are moderate. For him, it is the mean, it is the middle way again, between that excess and the deficiency. So the deficiency here would be closed-mindedness. This again it's the lack, right, where we're not open at all. That's obviously the deficiency, but what's the extreme or what's the excess? I think this would be where we are open to like literally every view, even after inquiry. Now, this is an excess because clearly some views are irrational, right? And once considered, you don't have to be open to them anymore in the name of open-mindedness, unless and until there's new evidence. But it's okay to dismiss a view once we've done the inquiry, so long as we do that on the basis of good reasons. G.K. Chesterton put it this way. I love this quote. He says, an open mind is really a mark of foolishness, like an open mouth. Mouths and minds were made to shut. They were made to open only in order to shut. Now, of course, this is something of an overstatement, and of course, Chesterton can sometimes overstate, but that's okay, right? We can sort of see what he's saying. He's talking about the excess. The virtue, then, if we can try to find where the middle way is, the virtue is to be open to considering a view, but only so long as we can find the evidence for it and let that guide us to truth. What we're doing is we're letting reason and evidence guide us to the truth.
I can learn from everybody. And
Mm.
when I arrived in Cambridge, week number 1, I looked around looking for someone who did not share my background.
Mm.
And I've been doing it ever since. I think the way in which God helped save me from that kind of cocksuredness that legitimizes any behavior is that I'm constantly prepared to listen, seriously listen,
Mm.
to people that don't share my worldview. And so when I debated the people you've mentioned, I prepared, read all their books so far as I could, and thought through how seriously am I to take this. And I think my confidence, and I prefer to use the word confidence than being cocksure,
Mhm.
has grown because of those exposures. But I'm still ready at the age of 81 to take the argument seriously.
I agree with Lennox that I much prefer thinking about confidence or perhaps the word conviction. I really like the word conviction here rather than certainty. You can have 100% confidence and still have a few questions. Right? You can be absolutely have absolute conviction about something, but still be open-minded, still be in a place where you're willing to ask the questions. You're willing to consider an objection. I actually think that Jesus was often calling people to open-mindedness, which might be surprising to some because people would probably think of Christians as typically narrow-minded or closed-minded. But he's often calling people to consider. Again, not to be so open that they just let anything in, but not closed-minded where they don't have, as he would put it, ears to hear or eyes to see. I think the religious leaders of Jesus' day are best seen as religious fundamentalists who are just completely closed-minded, right? Why didn't they believe in Jesus as the Messiah? Well, Jesus just didn't fit the bill. He didn't fit their expectations, and they were just completely locked into those expectations. In fact, Jesus begins to talk in parables. And why would he talk in parables? Is it just to confuse people? I don't think so. I think what Jesus is up to there is trying to get people to press in, to sort of be shocked or even offended a bit, such that they would press in and think about it and consider it, that they would have ears to hear and find the truth, because they might just have the Messiah standing right there in front of them. Now, this highlights a kind of scary fact here. It's the fact that we may be fundamentalists without realizing it. We may be closed-minded about something, but just not cognizant to the fact that we are so closed-minded. Most people don't readily say, right, I'm a fundamentalist, that's me. But they definitely are, at least as it relates to particular areas. Again, someone might not be a fundamentalist about everything. They might be very open in one area, but be completely closed-minded in another. Even Alex O'Connor seems to imply that Christopher Hitchens himself was something of a fundamentalist.
Hitchens was right that there is a lot of arrogance and certainty and violence in the history of religious thought, but let's not pretend that he didn't have a bit of confidence himself.
So the posture of fundamentalism can be a very subtle thing. I seriously doubt that Christopher Hitchens would think of himself as a atheistic fundamentalist, as he, rails against religious fundamentalists. But he sure seemed dismissive, and he sure seemed closed-minded at times. Again, the religious leaders of Jesus' day probably thought they were doing the Lord's work. But again, couldn't come to grips with the fact that they perhaps had the Messiah right there in front of them. Sometimes it's so very obvious that someone is closed-minded about an issue, even though they may not realize it at all. So I think what we have to do is work to have ears to hear. And I think the proof is if one is willing to engage in dialogues and really listen and really consider other views. Now, again, like, people will have outlandish and irrational views, and we are going to dismiss some views, but we should do it on the basis of good reasons. People will say things that are even silly at times, but we should still dismiss their views only when we have good reasons for doing so. At the end of the day, I think we should be willing to question everything. I just think we should be reflective about what we believe. Even those very, very important beliefs, even those very cherished beliefs. Again, this is not an issue of how convicted you are, about how confident you are. You can be ready and willing to give your life for a belief, but still willing to question that belief, willing to interrogate it, willing to ask, what are my reasons to think that this is true? In this, I think we begin to develop ears to hear, and we'll have rational beliefs and be led to the truth. Hey, if you've made it to the end of this video, let me just take a second to ask that you would subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot if you subscribe. And if you like this content, consider sharing it. But either way, thanks so much for watching.